question to ask about the Paris Agreement is whether it is environmentally adequate. And the clear answer is no. I mean, you can take the attitude, if a glass is half full or half empty, uncontroversially scientific statement is 50% of the volume of the glass is filled by molecules of water. That's scientifically unexceptionable. But if you call it half full or half empty, that's a normative statement. That's a value-laden statement. So I think a similar thing applies here. Ajay Mathur and I would agree that 1.5, as scientists pointed out, is in the rear view mirror. 2 degrees centigrade, we are not going to be there at the current rate things are going. And so on these two we agree. But I think the real crux of the problem here was that the scientific information available on this, in a remarkable consensus, the entire 195 nations ignored the science. Now, Dr. Mathur said, of course, that while going to the meeting, to the Paris conference, that there will be an agreement on numbers was unlikely. So that's one part of the story. But the global story was already laid out by the UNFCCC Secretariat in the synthesis report on the aggregate effect of the INDCs. This was mandated by the earlier COP. They were supposed to do this. And so you find that if you want a 66% probability of staying below 2 degrees centigrade, and you are allowed, just in terms of carbon dioxide, 1,000 gigatons, you will have emitted, according to the INDCs, 542, that's more than half in the next 10 years, and 748 by 2030. So there's not much more carbon you could put into it, and this is really the now the idea that we have, that everything works, the real measure that you have of the limiting maximum temperature increase should be in terms of cumulative emission. These are cumulative emissions. So if you have a 50% probability, then the total emissions you are allowed in the future, we are not talking about historical emissions, is 1,300. Okay? And the same 542, but that's still a little less than half, will be over by 2025, and if you get to about 2030, a little more than a half is over. Okay? So the numbers are very tight. How bad 1.5 is from this point of view, Tejal will describe in a talk later. The point was, this was known before Paris, and that is a point I would like to emphasize. 1.5 is hot air, but why hot air? I think there are some details to that. So what happened to the developing countries? And I think if you take the historical record, and it's a good thing to keep in mind that next year will be the 25th anniversary of the signing of the UNFCCC. So we have been debating this for a pretty long while. And there has been an entire history to these negotiations, the details of which are not for discussion now. And so various dividing lines which used to exist, which have characterized the negotiations, and there have been debates around them. In most cases, these dividing lines that the developing countries were keen after, they have not been maintained. So historical responsibility is virtually out. As the US spokespersons clarified after Paris, differentiation only going forward. Deep cuts from developed countries are not forthcoming, not even in line with the cuts recommended in IPCC AR4. There is no guarantee that cumulative emission space will be available for developing countries because of the very nature of the bottom-up architecture. So the size of the cake is limited, but everybody will take the share of the cake which they think is necessary for them. So we are framed in these terms. There is no clarity of the carbon space which will be available for developing countries. A major, I think, what tilted the balance in the negotiation, and I think this is quite important, that China is no longer a developing country. And that is really, it's a significant fact because we have been 25 years in the making of the this agreement. Some assurances are there, and two of the major ones, finance and technology transfer, as you have heard, are not well settled. So, what is available for the future? So, what do the INDCs tell us is likely to happen? So, 204 gigatons of carbon, I am shifted from carbon dioxide, which is the UNFCCC calculation, to our own, which is 204 gigatons of carbon, will be exhausted by 2030. And depending on the probability, 325 to 545 gigatons of carbon are available up to 2100. Who is going to claim the bulk of this? The USA will emit more in absolute terms than than India within this range. The 19 gigatons you see here is actually their INDC up to 2025. So this is not quite possibly the estimate. The Annex 1 countries together will emit 61 gigatons, China with 64 gigatons, and so 120 gigatons out of 204 are already accounted for. So the rest of the world has to do with what is remaining. So I think I don't want to go into the details of this because of lack of time, and I think the PowerPoint will be available. I was just amused by Ajay Mathur's remark that we are leaders in this business. Actually, the idea is very simple, has been around for 20-25 years, as long as the UNFCCC, even earlier. It was first mentioned in a Dutch paper written for a volume edited by Sunita Narayan and Anil Agarwal. One version of this was even presented in a collected work of on this subject by the then Environment Minister from Pakistan. So Pakistan Minister, for Science and Technology. So the idea has been around. We are the latest to bring up a new set of calculations. So no claims on the idea. So in this scenario, with no major cuts, well, major, it depends on your point of view, but cuts which are not in line with an equitable sharing of carbon space by various measures of equity. I am not just talking of per capita, it could be weighted, HDI, GDP, you can do various things with it. So in all these scenarios, with the kind of emissions that you have projected by the INDCs for the Annex 1, the fact that China played the game back to the Annex 1 countries, the demand from Annex 1 countries had always been on the lines, declare your peaking year. So when China, after 25 years, had the confidence that it could get on to a path of green growth, they said, okay, we'll give you a peaking year. So they gave a peaking year or a range for it. But what they did not specify was the rate of increase to the peak and the rate of decline from the peak, which in terms of cumulative emissions makes some important difference. But of course, you can have a rough projection. Our projection of 64 is based on a GDP growth rate, but they are at liberty to vary without violating their INDC. So what kind of scenarios do you expect? And this, I think, is the thing we need to look forward to. What kind of future do we expect with this? So one is, first scenario is no progress in tightening emissions, sharp breach of the carbon budget, we will emit more than the allowed cumulative emissions for 2 degrees centigrade, global progress towards serious climate damage. But I believe that this scenario on the whole is unlikely. I know if you have Donald Trump in United States, Theresa May, Boris Johnson in UK and whoever it is in Australia, it is still possible that scenario 1 will come true. But I would think for various reasons which we can perhaps discuss later is unlikely. A more likely scenario, I think, is a gradual tightening of the limits. It will be ramped up, ratcheting up of ambition is the phrase in the game. Developed country targets will tighten slowly. Many of them have peaked in infrastructure building, etc. And so, there is a problem of infrastructure renewal where the US has something of a crisis, and that somehow seems not to be discussed in the climate game. But that's a separate story. So developing country targets, however, will tighten significantly. How much? We can have various scenarios. Even in this scenario, there will be a moderate breach of the carbon budget. A third scenario, likely, it is difficult to say how likely, that there is no progress in the short term, that we spend another 10 years discussing it, and the next IPCC report, AR6 or AR7, will precipitate matters, just as the Bali Action Plan was triggered by AR4, AR6 or 7 will trigger the emergency response. So then the argument will be of urgency. And when that happens, most likely the global pressure will be on all countries to undertake reductions. In such a scenario, if you have not been there with utilizing carbon in a manner conducive to your development, then that road of your development is shut for good. So this is, I think, a third scenario. So why do we get to this? Why do we get to this situation? And why is it that we need to be, what else is it that we need to be concerned with in this context? And a lot of this neutral kind of language, this discourse that we have in the climate change game, which is I sort of tried to mimic, I am not really very good at it in this slide. But the point at issue is that it is not just global warming we are talking about, but it is global warming in an unequal world. Internationally unequal and domestically unequal. Clear developed country focus on preserving the status quo. You see, when you talk about behavior change and you load the onus onto the consumer, what is very often missed is the onus on the producers, the corporates, the firms, enterprises. It is that side, the production side, in an overemphasis on consumption, which is missed in the story. So, developed countries are focused on preserving the status quo because of the nature of their reductions. China can strike an independent deal for itself, as it has proved before Paris. The terms of the Paris Agreement, I believe, were first fashioned in the Obama-Xi Jinping statement, and in fact, the broad contours of the Paris Agreement and what is acceptable or unacceptable is visible in the Holland Declaration which Xi Jinping declared from Beijing a month before Paris. If you read that document, you will see the Paris Agreement slowly getting fleshed out. Unfortunately, as a countervailing force in dealing with this kind of pressures, environmental movements in developed countries, though well-intentioned, are completely unaware of developing country burdens. And this we can elaborate later. Also, environmental movements, which do constitute, I think, an important player in the global climate arena, have an overemphasis on technology instead of the economics. Naomi Klein, perhaps you know, is a very good example. In her book, you see for the entire rhetoric of political economy that the book begins with, the solution at the end of all these chapters is divestment in coal company and or the problems of how technology is developed under capitalism in her language. So I think that's part of the problem. A lot of interest groups which have fought for cutting down investment in coal divestment are bringing pressure. One of the first consequences of this is the cancellation of a thermal power project. Guess where? Bangladesh. So there is a power project which is in trouble, and everybody is focused. There are pollution issues. That's part of the story. But the first power project to be sort of come under the scanner in this form is in Bangladesh. So it is not likely. So even when divestment in coal starts, when cutting off coal thermal power plant starts, where will it happen first is up, I think, for discussion. I think we have paid in the climate discussions, in scenario building, looking into the future, not adequate attention to political economy. So I think global and national economic considerations matter. If you take the scenario today in the world, especially the terms of how Paris Agreement frames it, this is nothing like what we have been discussing for the last, out of the 25, almost 20 years. So the bottom-up architecture, as it is called, is the establishment that of the United States being in the driver's seat of the terms of a climate agreement, in contrast to Kyoto, where they had to stand outside, and only in the Delhi COP they sort of came back in a certain fashion, unfortunately with Indian assistance. So the US, that the fact that they cannot get climate change and a numerical target of any form passed by their domestic political considerations, and that has in part, among other things, led to this current situation. This is not what we thought of when 1992 happened. In fact, the United States was the first to ratify the UNFCCC. So I think what explains this current agreement, I think that none of the discussions we have had in climate policy, we have written tons of papers, all of us. And we here in this are players, but minor players in this. There is huge literature out there. Look at all the proposals, look at all the discussions. But what is, I think, more explanatory of what happened in Paris is the overall global economy structure. So I think we must be careful going into the future to pay attention not so much always to the architecture, the details, the negotiations, the bottom up, top down. I don't think that is where the game begins. The game begins in a larger context, and especially for the future. This, I think, is significant. So, what can we expect? So, the first thing is, none of the three outcomes, scenarios that I have listed, are by any stretch of imagination equitable. If they are unequal on the global scale, inequitable in the global scale. In its implementation, as we are placed today, they are very likely to be inequitable also on the national scale. So are there better outcomes? So I think it depends on the state of play of politics, both domestically and internationally. Depends on the state of play of movements and cooperation between political, social, environmental movements. And I must emphasize this because in the short period, Copenhagen onwards, that we here in TIS have been part of this, a part of this discourse on climate change. What are the terms of equity has not met with consensus. We have not been, I think, going to Paris. In fact, at Paris in some sense, in terms of a concrete alternative that equity-minded, not necessarily governments, I am talking also of civil society, what we could place forward as a unified position was perhaps the weakest before Paris. The process began at Durban to Paris. There was no game plan in place for civil society as a whole except generalities. So I think I think Paris is a turning point. Paris is going to make things harder, but I think that there is a need to, while on the one hand details do matter, but I think a larger discussion on what we think of as an equitable future and how to frame it is necessary. Single point agendas will be a problem. So what do we do in the meanwhile? We say the world must change, and the world doesn't change so easily. I think some of these, I would be in operationally in many ways in agreement with what Ajay Mathur was saying. Prepare for a heavy mitigation burden. Perhaps in economic terms, I might not share his optimism. When you think that water costs a tenth of what it costs in Mumbai, or even 100th of what it costs in Mumbai to a slum dweller for a resident of the United States, is not obvious that natural resources, what people have to pay for the use of resources or the environment, is equitably so easily distributed. So I think we need to understand the economics of it. We also need a vision of open-ended vision of well-being. The overemphasis on overconsumption, I think, that afterwards, if that happens, there will be treaty breakout. When, as Ajay Mathur was saying, I was a bit amused because when developed countries walk out of agreement, it is called walking out. If India were to leave the agreement, it will be called treaty breakup. And so, the arms control language will appear. When the developed countries leave, it is walk out. So, the fault is not their walking out, but it is the fault of the architecture. So, you see, one has to, I think, we ensure that, a future breakout does not happen from us, for instance. And meantime, I think we need far more attention on adaptation. Not narratives, not descriptive, but much harder analytical work on adaptation is in the agenda. And especially in the case of adaptation, which is more generally true of the climate game, I think we need better ways of coping with uncertainty. So this is not, I think, as concrete, I'm done, 30 seconds. This is not as concrete perhaps as you might have expected, but in some sense you will pardon me if it is me speaking to myself in part, trying to clarify what my ideas are of what, given the significance of Paris, what our larger agenda should look like, or rather what my larger agenda should look like. Thank you. I'll stop.